The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the whisper of wind through the trees was the only sound that filled the wilderness. The sky, once a crisp blue, had turned a dull gray as storm clouds rolled in from the mountains. I had been trekking for hours through the dense forest, unaware of just how lost I was, until it was too late. Now, standing at the edge of a ravine, I had no choice but to face the truth. Something had gone terribly wrong. I was completely and utterly alone in the wilderness. My name is Jake, and I'm a seasoned hiker, someone who thought they knew how to survive in the wild. I had done my research, made my preparations, and set out for what was supposed to be an easy weekend hike in the Appalachian Mountains. But here I was, with no map, no GPS, and nothing but the growing sense of dread gnawing at me as I realized I had wandered far off the beaten path. The trail, once marked with the familiar signs of civilization, had disappeared, swallowed by the thick brush and towering trees that stretched for miles. I had been foolish, overconfident. I knew the wilderness like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. But I had lost track of time, misjudged the terrain, and before I knew it, the storm had caught up with me. The sound of distant thunder rumbled through the trees, and I could feel the pressure in the air, the calm before the storm. If I didn't find shelter soon, I was in trouble. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The ravine below me was too deep to cross without risking a fall, and the trees above offered little protection from the coming storm. I needed to make a decision fast. Should I climb down into the ravine and try to find shelter? Or should I move forward, hoping to find higher ground before the storm broke? Instinctively, I started to move. I decided to keep walking, hoping to find a way out. My legs were sore from the miles I had already put behind me, but I pushed on, the sense of urgency growing with every step. The first raindrops hit, cold and sharp against my skin. Within moments, the downpour turned into a torrential rain, and I could feel the earth beneath my feet becoming slick and treacherous. I kept my head down, my focus solely on finding some kind of shelter. It was then that I saw it, a small cave, nestled in the side of a rock face, barely visible through the curtain of rain. It was a stroke of luck, or maybe something else, but I wasn't about to question it. Without hesitation, I scrambled toward it, my heart racing, hoping it would be enough to get me through the night. The cave was shallow, just deep enough to provide some cover from the storm. I crawled inside, drenched and cold, and collapsed against the damp stone wall. My breath came in heavy gasps as I tried to calm myself, my mind racing with thoughts of how I had ended up in this situation. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had prepared for everything, or so I thought. But nothing could have prepared me for the chaos of being lost in the wilderness. As I huddled in the cave, the storm raged on outside, the rain pounding against the rocks with a deafening roar. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I knew that if I didn't find a way to stay warm, I would be in serious trouble. I had no fire-starting materials, no extra layers of clothing, and no food. My stomach growled, reminding me just how unprepared I was for a situation like this. But I couldn't afford to panic. I had to stay calm, think clearly, and figure out what to do next. The cave offered some shelter, but it wasn't going to be enough to keep me safe for long. I needed to find a way out of this wilderness, before the storm turned into something far worse. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. I was beginning to feel the full weight of my isolation, the reality of the situation sinking in with each passing minute. The cave, though offering me some respite from the elements, felt like a prison, a cold, dark prison with no escape. I could feel my damp clothes clinging to my skin, my body shivering uncontrollably despite the small comfort of shelter. It wasn't just the physical cold that gnawed at me, it was the creeping sense of desperation that began to take hold. With no phone signal, no compass, and no way to communicate with the outside world, I knew that survival depended entirely on me. I couldn't afford to lose my focus. My mind raced through my training, the wilderness survival skills I had learned over the years. I had to stay calm, think strategically, and above all, I had to make it through the night. The hours dragged on as I huddled in the cave, my thoughts flickering from one problem to the next. First, I needed warmth. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and my body was starting to feel the effects of the cold. I had nothing to insulate myself with, no sleeping bag, no jacket, not even a spare shirt. But as I looked around the cave, a thought struck me. There was an abundance of dry pine needles and small branches scattered around the entrance. If I could gather enough of them, I might be able to build a makeshift bedding to insulate myself from the cold ground. My heart quickened as I realized I could make use of what was around me. Gathering the pine needles and branches wasn't easy. Every movement outside of the shelter exposed me to the freezing rain, and the wind howled through the trees like a wild animal. But the thought of getting even a little bit of warmth was enough to push me to endure the harsh conditions. I spent what felt like hours collecting whatever dry materials I could find, using the edge of my jacket to shield the handfuls of needles from getting soaked. When I returned to the cave, my hands were numb, my clothes wet and heavy against my body, but I forced myself to keep going. I spread the pine needles out as best I could and built a small nest of sorts, hoping that it would keep some of the cold at bay. Laying down on the makeshift bed, I curled into a ball, pulling my knees up to my chest. The wet ground beneath me was uncomfortable, but at least it wasn't freezing my skin directly. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside, hoping for some rest. But sleep didn't come. The adrenaline from the hike, the fear of being alone in the wilderness, and the gnawing hunger kept me awake. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since the morning. The pangs of hunger only intensified the discomfort, making it harder to focus on anything other than the fact that I was slowly running out of time. The longer I stayed in the cave, the more my situation became dire. As the hours passed, I realized that I couldn't just wait here for the storm to pass. I had no food, no fire, and no way of knowing when help would come, or even if help would come at all. It was then that I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would set out again, trying to find my way back to civilization. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my thoughts turning over and over as I planned my next move. My water bottle was almost empty, and I knew that I had to find a source of fresh water before dehydration became a threat. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. I had to be methodical, smart, and, most importantly, I had to keep my composure. The storm began to subside as the night wore on, and the relentless sound of rain turned into a soft, sporadic drizzle. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the exhaustion that weighed down on me. When morning finally arrived, it was far from a relief. The clouds were still thick, blocking out the sunlight and making everything seem eerily dim. I stood up, stretching my stiff muscles, and surveyed the cave one last time. It was time to move. I had no idea what awaited me outside, but I had no other choice. I gathered my things, my empty water bottle, my small first aid kit, and the faint hope that I could make it through the next stage of my journey. As I stepped out of the cave and into the wet wilderness, the landscape looked unrecognizable. The rain had left everything slick and treacherous, and the wind whipped through the trees, making each step feel more difficult than the last. I didn't know which direction to go. Every way seemed as hopeless as the next. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I had to keep moving forward. I decided to follow the sound of running water. I knew that rivers often led to larger bodies of water, and if I could find a river, I might be able to track it downstream to civilization. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one I had. As I made my way through the forest, my mind was focused solely on the sound of the water. Every step felt like a risk, as the slick ground made each movement uncertain. The trees around me were thick, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches heavy with rain. The world felt oppressive, like the forest was closing in on me. But after a few hours of stumbling through the mud and underbrush, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of rushing water. My heart leapt in my chest. I wasn't completely lost. There was a chance, a small one, that I could make it out of this alive. The river was not far from where I had been walking. I came upon it suddenly, the water flowing fast and cold, rushing over rocks and logs. It was powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous. But it was also my lifeline. I stood on the bank, staring at the water. My first instinct was to drink, but I knew better. The water was likely contaminated, and drinking it without proper purification could make me sick. But the river gave me hope. If I could follow it, I might find a road, a trail, or, if I was lucky, someone who could help me. With renewed resolve, I started walking along the riverbank, carefully avoiding the more treacherous spots where the current was strongest. The air was still damp, and the rain had left the landscape slick with mud, but I pressed on. It was the only option I had. Every now and then, I would glance around, looking for any signs of human activity, discarded trash, footprints, or even a faint trail that might lead me to safety. But there was nothing. Just the river, the forest, and the quiet. My stomach growled, and my legs ached, but I refused to stop. I had made it this far. There was no turning back now. And so, I kept walking, hoping that somewhere ahead of me there would be a way out. The hours dragged on as I followed the riverbank, my steps slow and deliberate. My body ached from the relentless movement, my muscles sore and stiff. The hunger gnawed at me, an ever-present reminder of my growing desperation. The forest around me felt both suffocating and vast, its unyielding silence amplifying the sense of isolation that had begun to sink deep into my bones. I had long since lost track of the time. The day had turned into a gray blur of cold and wet, and the storm had left the world around me looking like a forgotten place. Everything felt wrong. The trees seemed too tall, their shadows too deep, and the sound of the river, once a comforting guide, now felt like a cruel reminder of just how far away I was from civilization. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that weighed on me. It was the constant awareness of my vulnerability. I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town, or if anyone would even be looking for me. The thought of being truly alone in this wilderness, of not being found, was almost too much to bear. But I didn't have the luxury of indulging in despair. I had to keep moving. The river curved around a bend, and as I followed it, I noticed something ahead. A cluster of rocks jutted out from the riverbank, and behind them, I could see the faint outline of what looked like a small clearing. My heart leapt. Maybe this was it, a way out. Maybe I had found a trail, or at least a sign of human presence. I pushed through the brush, my legs unsteady, but driven by a glimmer of hope. As I approached the clearing, I realized that what I had thought was a trail was just a narrow gap in the trees, leading deeper into the forest. There was no sign of a road, no trail markers, nothing to suggest that I was on the right path. My hope collapsed, replaced by a deep frustration that I struggled to keep under control. It was then that I heard the sound. A low, guttural growl, followed by the rustling of leaves behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as I tried to make sense of the sound. It came again, closer this time. A bear. I had read about bear encounters, about the importance of staying calm, of making yourself appear larger, of backing away slowly. But in that moment, all of that advice seemed useless. The growl came again, and then I saw it, a dark shape emerging from the trees. The bear was huge, its thick fur glistening with rainwater, its eyes fixed on me. My heart raced, panic surging through me. I remembered the bear spray in my bag, but I had left it behind in the cave. I was defenseless. The bear took a step forward, its massive paws making deep impressions in the soft earth. It was hungry, and I was alone. I took a slow step back, trying not to make any sudden movements. The bear didn't flinch, its gaze never leaving me. I was aware of the river behind me, the drop-off of the bank just a few feet away. If I could just move fast enough, maybe I could slip past it, get to the river, and use the water to put some distance between us. But the bear wasn't giving me that chance. It growled again, a deep, threatening sound, and started to move toward me. My mind raced as I tried to think of something, anything, to do. I knew I couldn't outrun it. The bear was faster, stronger, and far more capable of navigating this terrain than I was. My only option was to make myself look as unthreatening as possible, and pray it didn't decide to charge. I slowly raised my arms, trying to make myself look bigger. I spoke in a calm, steady voice, though my breath came in ragged gasps. "Easy, easy," I muttered, as if the bear could understand. It didn't stop. It didn't even seem to acknowledge my attempts at de-escalation. I was frozen, and time seemed to stretch out into an eternity. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing I could do. The bear's eyes flickered for a moment, and I saw something in them, an expression of confusion, of curiosity, perhaps, but it didn't move closer. For a brief moment, I thought I might be able to back away and slip past, but then the bear made a low huffing noise, as if settling into its decision. It wasn't leaving. In a desperate move, I quickly scanned the area, my eyes locking onto a large branch that lay beside me, half hidden in the brush. Without thinking, I grabbed it. It wasn't a weapon, it was just a branch, a way to make myself look more formidable. I raised it above my head, trying to look more threatening. The bear hesitated. It was enough. Just enough. For a fleeting moment, I saw it take a step back, its ears flattening slightly as if weighing its options. I took the opportunity. Without another thought, I spun around and dashed for the river. The water rushed beneath me as I slid down the muddy embankment, my legs giving out from the effort. But I didn't stop. I scrambled forward, slipping and sliding, but keeping my focus on the riverbank ahead. When I finally reached the water's edge, I turned to look back. The bear was still there, watching me from the forest edge, but it hadn't followed. It seemed confused, its growls fading into the distance. I took shallow, ragged breaths as the adrenaline started to wear off, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I stood there, staring into the forest, waiting for the bear to return, but the silence told me it was gone. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a slight sense of relief. But I couldn't afford to linger. My fight wasn't over. The river was my only hope, and I couldn't waste time. I had come so far. The bear might have been gone, but the wilderness was still here, vast, unforgiving, and full of dangers I hadn't yet seen. I had to keep moving. There was no other choice. I waded into the river, the cold water seeping into my boots, and forced myself to move forward. With every step, I reminded myself of one simple truth: this wasn't over. The fight had just begun. The river roared around me as I waded through it, its cold current biting at my legs. The water churned with force, making it difficult to keep my balance, but I forced myself to push forward. Every step was a struggle, the weight of the water pulling at my feet, the pressure from the river trying to drag me downstream. But I couldn't stop. I had survived the night, the bear encounter, and the storm, and I wasn't about to give up now. As I made my way along the riverbank, the landscape began to change. The dense forest was thinning, and the trees were spaced farther apart, revealing more open ground. The rush of water was still deafening, but now there was a faint light peeking through the clouds, signaling that the storm had passed. The air, still damp, smelled fresh, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to take a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest loosen just a little. But that moment of peace didn't last long. The cold had sunk deep into my bones, and I was acutely aware of how vulnerable I still was. I had no food, no way to make fire, and no idea how much further I had to go before I might find help. My stomach growled painfully, a constant reminder of my growing need. I needed to find something to eat, soon. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, standing at the edge of the river. I glanced upstream, hoping for a glimpse of something that might signal civilization. Maybe a road, a cabin, anything. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of trees and rocks, the river snaking through the forest like a dark ribbon of uncertainty. The weight of my situation pressed down on me again, but I couldn't afford to let it break me. I had learned in the past that survival wasn't about what I didn't have, it was about what I could make do with. In that moment, I focused on the resources around me, the forest, the river, and what little I had on me. The realization hit me: I needed to fish. Fishing was something I'd done before, on lazy afternoons at home with a pole and a quiet pond, but now it was a necessity. My body was weak from hunger, and I couldn't keep moving without fuel. I scanned the river, looking for any signs of fish or food sources. The current was fast, and the water was murky from the storm, but I had to try. I crouched low to the ground, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I could see that the water was filled with rocks and debris, creating little eddies where fish might hide. I gathered a few large stones from the shore, the cold rocks feeling heavy in my hands as I stacked them along the bank to form a small trap. The idea was simple. I would funnel the fish into a small area using the rocks and try to catch them by hand. It wasn't an ideal method, but it was the only one I had. I worked quickly, arranging the rocks into a crude barrier that would guide the fish toward a narrow gap where I hoped to snatch them out. My fingers were stiff and slow, the cold sapping my strength, but I forced myself to concentrate. It wasn't long before I had set the trap. I crouched low beside it, waiting. Time seemed to stretch on as I sat there in silence, watching the murky water swirl past. The hunger was beginning to feel like a constant ache in my gut, gnawing at me, but I kept my focus. I had no choice but to trust that my plan would work. Every now and then, I peered through the water, watching for any movement. And then I saw it. A flash of silver. I nearly held my breath as I watched the fish dart toward the gap in the rocks. It was small, but it was enough. With trembling hands, I reached into the water, my fingers brushing against the slick scales. I missed once, then twice, but on the third try, I managed to grab hold. My heart raced as I pulled the fish out of the water, a wave of triumph flooding through me. I didn't have a fire, and I didn't have the tools to cook it properly, but I had something far more important: food. I looked at the small fish in my hand, still wriggling, and knew I had to make it count. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I quickly removed the fish's scales using a sharp rock, something I had learned to do in a survival class years ago. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. I ate the fish raw, the cold flesh almost unbearable against my teeth, but my body needed it. With each bite, I could feel my energy slowly returning. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough to stave off the hunger for now. I didn't linger long by the river after eating. I had to keep moving. As I wiped my hands on the wet grass, I scanned the area once more, noting the direction of the river. The water was still flowing downstream, and I knew that if I kept following it, I might find a way out. If I was lucky, maybe even a road or a trail. I took a deep breath and began walking again, my legs still sore from the long journey. I could feel the weight of the day pressing down on me, but I refused to let exhaustion slow me. Each step forward was a step closer to survival. As I walked, the landscape shifted once more. The trees were thinning even more, and the sound of the river began to fade, replaced by the distant noise of something else. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then I heard it clearly, the sound of a vehicle, the unmistakable hum of an engine. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Could it be? I looked around, scanning the horizon. Through the trees, I could see the faintest outline of a dirt road, winding its way through the forest. The road. There was a chance. No, it was more than a chance. It was real. I broke into a run, the last remnants of my strength fueling me as I pushed through the underbrush, moving faster than I had all day. My legs protested, but I didn't stop. The sound of the engine grew louder, and I realized that the road was closer than I had dared hope. I emerged from the trees and onto the dirt road, my eyes wide, scanning for any sign of life. I was nearly delirious with relief. There was a car parked in the distance, and I saw a figure walking toward it. Someone who could help. I took a few unsteady steps forward, my voice breaking with emotion as I shouted, "Hey! Hey, over here!" The figure turned, its face unreadable at first, but as they saw me, their expression changed. The car came to life with the engine's roar, and the stranger hurried toward me. "I'm lost," I gasped, barely able to stand. "I've been out here for days. Please, can you help me?" The stranger nodded quickly, helping me into the car and offering me water and a warm blanket. As the car started moving, I looked out the window at the forest I had just escaped. I was out. I was alive. But I knew something would stay with me from this experience, something more than just the physical scars. The wilderness had tested me in ways I never imagined, and I had fought, inch by inch, to survive. And as I looked ahead, I realized that the wild would always be a part of me. I had learned something vital, that survival wasn't just about the skills you carry, it was about the will to keep moving, no matter what. And with that, I finally allowed myself to relax. The wilderness had claimed me, but I had claimed it right back.